you want to be comfortable and you want to have friends and you want to be like early days, being like short, being 5 feet tall.
He's played a penguin-shaped supervillain, a con man, a tyrant father, a vengeful divorce lawyer, and one of the most cruelly funny sitcom characters in television history. He's directed Jack Nicholson and produced Quentin Tarantino before the world knew who Tarantino was. He's 4 feet 10 inches tall, and for most of his career, that number was treated as a punchline. But underneath the punchline is a real medical condition that has quietly shaped almost every physical hour of his life. And today, in his early 80s, Danny DeVito is finally talking about it in his own words. This isn't the sanitized version of his story. This is the one built from what he's actually said, on the record, over 50 years. And some of it really is hard to hear. Daniel Michael DeVito Jr. was born on November 17, 1944, in Neptune, New Jersey, the youngest of 3 children in a working-class Italian-American family. His father ran a small pool hall and later a construction supply business. His mother kept the household together. Neptune wasn't glamorous. It was a shore town, blue-collar, Catholic, tight-knit. DeVito has described his childhood in interviews as loving but ordinary, the kind of upbringing where nobody expected the short kid from the Jersey Shore to end up directing Jack Nicholson or standing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger on a movie poster. What made DeVito's childhood different wasn't trauma in the dramatic, cinematic sense. It was something quieter and more physical. Even as a young boy, he was noticeably smaller than his classmates. Other kids noticed, teachers noticed, and DeVito, being DeVito, learned early that he had 2 options. Let it define him as a target, or turn it into a weapon of personality. He chose the second one, and it took years of practice to get good at it. He's talked about being bullied for his size growing up, and about the strange loneliness of always being underestimated in a room before he'd said a single word. He's also talked warmly about the friendships that formed around that. He's mentioned that some of his closest childhood connections were with tall girls who felt just as self-conscious about their height as he did about his, just from the opposite direction. It's a small detail, but it says something about how early he learned that difference, of any kind, tends to isolate people in the same room without them realizing they have something in common. Here's the part of the story that clickbait headlines love to sensationalize and mostly get wrong. Danny DeVito is not short because of some tragic, mysterious accident or an unspecified rare disease invented for a thumbnail. He has a well-documented genetic condition called multiple epiphyseal dysplasia, also known by its older medical name, Fairbanks disease. MED affects the epiphyses, the growing ends of the long bones in the arms and legs. In a person without the condition, cartilage at those growth plates gradually hardens into bone as a child develops, allowing limbs to lengthen normally. In someone with MED, that process is disrupted. The result is shorter stature, but more importantly, joint pain, a distinctive gait. And this is the part that rarely makes it into the flattering profiles. Early onset osteoarthritis that gets worse, not better, with age. People with MED often don't even get diagnosed until childhood or adolescence, when the joint pain starts showing up during ordinary physical activity, long after the visible height difference already made them a target for teasing. DeVito stands at 4 feet 10 inches. He's joked about it more than once. He said that on a good day, he can round himself up to 5 feet. The joke is real, and so is the disease underneath it. Doctors have long noted that people with MED frequently deal with pain in the hips, knees, and ankles that starts decades before it would in an unaffected person. That's the quiet, less photographed cost of a body that never grew the way most bodies grow. A lifetime of joint stress that catches up with you. For most of his career, DeVito didn't frame his height around the medical explanation at all. He simply lived in the body he had and built a persona strong enough that people forgot to ask questions. It's only in recent years, in interviews reflecting on his life at 80, that he's spoken more openly about what MED has actually meant for him physically, day to day, for decades. Before there was any acting career, there was a very different plan. As a young man, DeVito trained as a hairdresser and worked in a salon owned by his sister. He took it seriously. Beauty school wasn't a joke to him. It was a trade, a skill, a way to make a living in a world that didn't seem to have an obvious lane for a 5-foot guy from Neptune to become a leading man. The break came almost by accident. While working in the salon, he crossed paths with people connected to the theater world, and on something close to a whim, he applied to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York in 1962, not even to study acting, but to study makeup. The story he's told over the years is that the school asked him to perform a monologue as part of the application process, even though he had zero acting background. He did a piece from The Rainmaker. Somebody in that room saw something. He wasn't offered a spot in makeup. He was offered a spot in acting. It's one of those genuinely strange hinge points in a person's life. A guy who came to learn how to do stage makeup walked out having been redirected into a full acting track instead. He didn't say yes immediately, but when the school followed up with a partial scholarship offer, he took it, and that decision quietly rerouted the next 60 years of his life. In the mid-1960s, DeVito was a broke, mostly unemployed actor living in New York, sharing a small, unglamorous apartment with another young hopeful trying to make it, Michael Douglas. Douglas, of course, was the son of Kirk Douglas, one of the biggest movie stars in the world, but by DeVito's own account, that fact barely came up. They were both just two guys trying to get cast in anything, splitting rent, eating cheap food, running around New York with headshots nobody wanted. It would have been easy for that friendship to fade once one of them started finding real success. It didn't. Years later, when Douglas was producing an adaptation of the stage play, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he remembered his old roommate, and remembered that DeVito had actually already played the role of Martini in a stage production of the story years earlier. DeVito was cast. The film, directed by Milos Forman, went on to sweep the major categories at the Oscars, one of only a handful of films in history to win Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay. DeVito's screen time in it was brief, but put him on the map in a way that a decade of auditions hadn't. That friendship with Douglas has outlasted almost everything else in DeVito's professional life. Decades later, the two are still close, still work together periodically, and DeVito still tells the story of those cockroach apartment years with more affection than bitterness. It's worth pausing here, because the overnight success version of this story skips the part that actually explains DeVito's personality. Between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s, DeVito was, by any reasonable definition, a struggling actor. He auditioned constantly and got rejected constantly. He worked odd jobs to survive. He's talked about how brutal that stretch was, not just financially, but psychologically. The accumulation of hundreds of no's from casting directors who, more than once, told him bluntly that he was too short, too unusual looking, not what they were picturing. Hollywood in that era had a very narrow idea of what a leading man, or even a reliable supporting actor, was supposed to look like, and DeVito didn't fit any version of it. Rather than disguise that, he leaned into being unmistakably, unapologetically himself. It's a decision that reads as confident in hindsight, but at the time it was a gamble with genuinely uncertain odds, made by a guy with very little money and very little leverage. In 1978, DeVito was offered the role of Louis De Palma, the small, venomous, gloriously unlikable dispatcher on the sitcom Taxi. Taking a TV role instead of chasing film work was, at the time, considered a step down for a working film actor. Television and film were far more segregated worlds than they are now, and plenty of people around him thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. Louis De Palma became one of the most memorable characters in American sitcom history precisely because he wasn't likable in any conventional sense. He was petty, cruel, and small-minded, and audiences couldn't get enough of him. DeVito won a Golden Globe for the role and, not long after, an Emmy. The performance proved something that mattered a great deal for the rest of his career. Audiences didn't need a character to be good to love watching him. They needed him to be real. Taxi also gave DeVito something else that would shape the rest of his life entirely. It's where he met Rhea Perlman. DeVito and Perlman met in the early 1970s, before either of them had major roles, and started dating not long after. They moved in together within weeks of meeting. She joined the cast of Taxi a little later in a recurring role, and the two built both a family and a working creative partnership that ran in parallel for the next 4 decades. They married in 1982, after roughly a decade together, and had 3 children, Lucy, Grace, and Jake, all of whom went into entertainment in some form. DeVito and Perlman acted together repeatedly over the years, most memorably as the grotesque, neglectful Wormwood parents in DeVito's 1996 film adaptation of Roald Dahl's Matilda. A bit of casting that only works because the two of them had real, lived-in chemistry built over 20 years of marriage by that point. In 1983, while still filming Taxi, DeVito and Perlman quietly started their own production company, Jersey Films, a decision that would end up mattering just as much to film history as anything DeVito did on camera. Jersey Films became one of the defining independent production companies of the 1990s. DeVito, alongside producing partners Michael Schamberg and later Stacey Sher, used the company to back scripts that bigger studios were too nervous to touch. The most famous example is also one of the most consequential decisions in modern film history. When a major studio passed on a strange, structurally unconventional crime script from a then largely unknown filmmaker named Quentin Tarantino, Jersey Films stepped in and helped keep the project alive. That script became Pulp Fiction, released in 1994, and it reshaped American independent cinema almost overnight. Jersey Films went on to produce a run of critically respected films through the 90s and 2000s, including Get Shorty, Erin Brockovich, and Garden State, among others. DeVito wasn't the flashiest producer in the room, but he had a genuine eye for scripts that other executives were too cautious to greenlight, a direct extension of his own career-long instinct to bet on the unconventional choice. DeVito's directing career developed almost in parallel with his acting one. His feature directorial debut, Throw Mama from the Train, 1987, was a dark comedy he insisted on directing himself as a condition of doing the film at all. 2 years later, he directed and starred in The War of the Roses, 1989, a brutally funny, genuinely bleak film about a marriage's collapse that reunited him with his Romancing the Stone co-stars Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner. The film struck enough of a nerve in Germany that its title reportedly entered the language as informal shorthand for an especially ugly divorce. In 1992, DeVito took a considerably more serious turn, directing Hoffa, a biographical drama about labor leader Jimmy Hoffa, starring Jack Nicholson in the title role. It was a deliberate departure from comedy, dense, political, and unflinching, and it demonstrated that DeVito's ambitions behind the camera went well beyond the persona audiences knew him for in front of it. That same year, 1992, he also took on one of his most transformative acting roles, Oswald Cobblepot, the Penguin, in Tim Burton's Batman Returns. The role required hours of prosthetic makeup and a full physical and vocal transformation, and it remains one of the more unusual, committed performances of his career, genuinely unsettling in a franchise better known for camp. DeVito directed and starred in Matilda in 1996, playing the film's cartoonishly awful father opposite Rhea Perlman as the equally awful mother. The movie has become a beloved family classic in the decades since, but its production carried a heavier weight than audiences realized at the time. The film's young star, Mara Wilson, was dealing with her own mother's terminal illness during filming. In interviews over the years, Wilson has spoken warmly about how DeVito and Perlman treated her during that period. Less like employers and more like family looking out for a kid going through something enormous. It's a small, quiet detail in DeVito's career, but it's one of the more consistent threads people close to him describe. Underneath the loud on-screen persona, the accounts of people who've actually worked with him tend to describe someone unusually generous with his time and attention off camera. In 2006, at 61 years old, DeVito joined the cast of a scrappy, low-budget cable comedy that almost nobody outside a small fan base had heard of. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. The show's creators, who were also its stars, were still relatively unknown, and adding an actor of DeVito's stature, in the industry sense, to a niche cable comedy was, on paper, an unusual move. It worked. His character, Frank Reynolds, a filthy, amoral, self-destructive millionaire slumming it with his adult children, became one of the show's central engines, and the series is still airing new seasons nearly 20 years later, one of the longest-running live-action comedies in American television history. DeVito has never been shy about how physically committed he stayed to that role well into his 70s and 80s. Stunts, physical comedy, and famously unglamorous scenes that most actors his age would have a body double handle. What's less discussed is the cost of that commitment on a body already dealing with the joint deterioration that comes with MED. He's spoken in more recent interviews about the toll decades of physical comedy have taken on his hips and knees. The ordinary, unglamorous arithmetic of doing your own stunts for 50 years inside a body that started with the structural disadvantage most actors never have to think about. In October 2012, after 30 years of marriage, DeVito and Perlman announced they were separating. 5 months later, they reconciled. It didn't hold permanently. In March 2017, they separated again, and this time it stayed that way. What's genuinely unusual, and what makes this part of DeVito's story worth telling honestly rather than dramatically, is what happened next. They didn't divorce. They're still legally married today.